Ready? Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Thank you guys for showing up today. I appreciate it. I appreciate the big crowd. A little bit about myself to start out. First of all, how many of you have come to one of my presentations while I was here? Because I made a promise at the last one. I wanted to. I promise I'll tell the rest of that story in a minute. But that's the way suspense writers do. We leave you with cliffhangers. So my name is Marc Cameron. I'm from Alaska. My beautiful wife is back there with pretty silver, we call it Alaska or Arctic blonde hair, which those of us with as much hair as I have are just happy that she has hair at all. My name is Marc Cameron. I'm a writer of the Tom Clancy Jack Ryan series, the New York Times bestselling Jericho, Quinn, and Arliss Cutter series. Jericho Quinn's about an OSI agent, Air Force OSI agent. Our son was an Air Force OSI agent. You'll notice a thread here about what I write and what I do and have done. And Arliss Cutter series, which I'm presently working on and kind of trying to bring those out more into the public eye, which are about a deputy United States Marshal based in Alaska. Imagine that. So I started my career in the police force in Weatherford, Texas back in 1984 when I was just barely old enough to buy my own bullets. And I had told my wife early on that I wanted to be a novelist and a theater professor for college. And then right before we got married, I confessed that I wanted to be a cop, and she married me anyway and bought me a bulletproof vest and a Smith Corona electric typewriter that first year when we were making about $6.67 an hour. Somehow she found the money. So she's been supportive, and for 20 years, I wrote and wrote and got rejected and got rejected and wrote and wrote. And when I finally did get published, after 20 years, that was about 20 years ago. So 40 years of success, right? What did Clive Cussler said? I was an overnight success that took me about 10 years. So I was with the police department for about 7 years. Oh, she has to remind me who I am. Thank you. Oh, that's right. I am not Marie. Thank you very much. I much appreciate it. I know everybody's leaving now. Sorry. So for about 7 years, I was with the police department in Weatherford, Texas, just west of Fort Worth. I got to do all kinds of different things. I don't have any Weatherford PD pictures up there, but I was a uniformed patrol officer. I was a mounted police officer. I told a story the other day about being in the crime police law enforcement panel about being a very green, very terrified young detective at about 26 years old, it's not like I had a lot of investigative acumen. I was just the last person standing, and nobody else wanted to get called out in the middle of the night. And this is when pagers were relatively new, and nobody really liked that idea of being bugged at church or on weekends or anything like that. So I fortunately, for a thriller writer, unfortunately for a growing mind, I got to work a lot of assaults and homicides and sexual assaults, and so I kind of had that. I was pitching to some people the other day an idea, and one of the guys that was pitching with me said, "You got to make yourself, like you've really seen some crap." And so I said, my career in law enforcement has been a graduate degree in evil, right? So we're writers, we spin a little bit. But it really kind of has been a thriller 101 kind of a life, and I'm very fortunate that way. Do you have to live that kind of life? Absolutely not. But it helps to know someone. It helps to be able to read about people in real life. It helps to be able to chat with folks. And anybody that's spent more than 30 seconds with me out in the hallway or the Grand Salon knows that I just love to tell stories. And so I think all of us do. That's why we're here, right? So I was a mounted police officer for a number of years, and a detective and juvenile case officer and things like that. And then in 1991, I got a job with the United States Marshal Service, which was my dream job. I wanted to be a deputy marshal since I was a little boy, watching True Grit and Cahill, U.S. Marshal, and then later on, I already was one, but The Fugitive with Tommy Lee Jones and that sort of thing. So I was deputy U.S. Marshal in Texas, in Idaho, and then for the last 15 years of my career or 16 years of my career in Alaska, where I retired as the chief deputy. So, and incidentally, along that whole Marshal Service career, I was writing short stories, and I started writing Westerns, and then my agent, I wanted to write thrillers, and she read my Westerns, sold my Westerns, and we eventually moved into thrillers because of the kind of life that I was leading and what I really wanted to write. So the other day, I told her, maybe yesterday, it all runs together, I told a story about, kind of to illustrate thrilling, how we are all mollusks, right? We're all just out there as writers, just sort of straining the world for interesting tidbits. And so I have been doing that for a long time, just as a law enforcement or just doing adventures. Like, you guys go fishing, you go out, if you go for a walk, there's things that happen around you that you can pick and choose and twist them around and maybe make them a little more interesting. So early after I got to Alaska, I was on actually just assigned for a little while to the Fugitive Task Force. Before I eventually ran the Fugitive Task Force in Alaska, made up of a bunch of different agencies. But because I was new, I didn't know the streets, I didn't know, what was where and who was who and all that stuff. And so we were working a particular bad guy. We call them bad guys, but we don't use quite as much terminology as Hill Street Blues and that sort of thing. But looking for a certain bad guy. And I was on one arrest team basically in the back of this big labyrinth of a bar that's in kind of midtown Anchorage. And it's really a cool bar. Like I said, you can look it up. It's Chilkoot Charlie's. You can look it up on Yelp. It's one of the reviews on Yelp said, "This is a great place. People have died here." So that really made me want to go visit as a deputy marshal. So this guy was actually across the street from, we call it Coots in Anchorage, across the street from Coots, and where we thought he was. And I was watching the back of it, and we have like the two sides. So if you're at the corner, I'm at the back, I can watch both sides, and the other team is approaching from, so they can watch the other two sides of this house he's in. Well, he snuck out a window and ran. And he ran by my team. And so I took off running. He ran across the street, traffic coming back and forth. I'm in this town that I don't know much about. I think it was about midnight, but it was summer. And so light still in Alaska. He ran into the bar, and it's set up with like these odd, it's not like a hall with little rooms off to the side. It's like room here, room there, stacked all over the place, and they're really hard. If you've been in there, it's an easy place to get lost. So I was running through and pushing through crowds and yelling, police, get down, because nobody knows what a U.S. Marshal is. So I'm like, please get down, writing, the stuff that you dream about when you're writing thrillers or just being a young cop, right? Deputy Marshal. We have different views about what cops are. So I was running after this guy, and the doors kept shutting in my face. And I got to a place where there was two ways to go, right? So I had to decide which way to go here. And I kind of, in tracking, we think about the natural lines of drift where people naturally go, which direction they go. And you can kind of, this is really sort of voodoo maybe a little bit, but you can kind of feel it if you listen. And so I G'd, and when he might have hawed. So I went to the right, and there was a door with some light underneath, and I could hear voices and kind of yells and yelps and screams coming from the other side. So I kicked open the door, and my team is right behind me, so they're like bumping up behind me. And I kicked open the door, and there was a girl's face right here, and she just had on a pair of jeans and a bra. And then behind her was another girl facing the other way in a pair of jeans and a bra, and both of them had halibut hooks through the skin of their back, the meat of their back, with a chain between the halibut hooks, 2 hooks each, and they were pulling at each other, and there was a red line on the floor, and they were pulling, trying to see who could pull the other one off the dead center before they either ripped the hooks out or, and to this day, I remember this girl, and she was very close to me. I opened the door, and I see my guy squirt out the back, and I just forgot about him. And she looked at me, and she goes, "Help me," like that, like reached up, and the guy, they got him running out the other side. When I went outside, I didn't work on an arrest report. They had him already in the car. I got my notebook out and I had to write everything down that had just happened, because I knew that kind of thing was going to go in a book. And it eventually went almost exactly, except it didn't happen in Alaska, almost exactly in a Jericho Quinn book. Back when I wrote when I was first getting published, you're never a prophet in your own country, right? And my kids, okay, Dad's a writer. But I got a really cool letter from my youngest son, who's in police work now. He's with Anchorage Police. I got a really cool letter from him when he read he was away at college, and he read my second Jericho Quinn. And he said, it's called Act of Terror. And he said, Dad, I hope that someday I can wheelie a Royal Enfield motorcycle into oncoming gunfire to save the girl. And I thought, you know what? That really is what I want. That little line right there, that's what I'm looking for when I'm thinking about writing a thriller. I want to wheelie a motorcycle into oncoming gunfire to save the girl. So, and incidentally, I like to write really strong female characters, and where it looks like my main male character or whatever might be saving the girl, she ends up generally saving herself, and sometimes saving the male characters as well. I think that, because I've seen that in real life. I want to talk about a couple of things real quick, and we're going to have to get out of here right at time because it's lunch, and I'm told we need to vacate the room right at the nick of time. I'm going to be around to answer questions or chat, and I love to talk craft. So, sorry about that. So I'll be out there in the salon or the open area afterwards if anybody has any other questions and we don't get to them. But I want to actually leave quite a bit of time for questions. So I'm going to go over just a couple of points, and then I would like to, if you will indulge me, take your questions for about the last 20 minutes. And so we can guide this the way you guys want it to go instead of me up here tell you what I think. Because a thriller is a subjective thing. Are mystery thrillers? Yeah, some of them. There's mystery thrillers. There's romantic thrillers. Can a sci-fi be a thriller? I don't know. You learned a lot while you're here, and I poked my head into some of the panels. You're learning a lot of great information about marketing. I'm not going to talk about that today, or where to put your book as far as genre. I'm not really going to talk about that today. What I'm talking about with thrillers really works with any genre. A good book, a good story is a good story. A compelling story is a compelling story. Now, my editor with Kensington, Gary Goldstein, he's got a mantra. He says, the first bit of editorial advice I got from him was, I need to kill more people in the first chapter. So his mantra is start with a massacre and then build from that, right? So you really need to start somewhere in the action. Now, in that vein, think about the first sentence. Think about the best first sentences you've ever read or written. I strive for that perfect first sentence. My literary agent, Robin Rue, is very fond of saying and telling me and new authors, sometimes you have to write 3 chapters to even get to the beginning of your book. Does that mean that those 3 chapters are wasted? Absolutely not. You can maybe plug them in. It might just be that they needed to be written to get to the beginning, but you had to go through that process, right? So everybody here can probably think of a favorite first sentence of a book. I used to go before the ability to do it on Amazon, and even now still, I like the tactile sensation, but go into a bookstore and just look through books at the first lines. Just read the first lines, show them the bookstore. People get sort of grouchy. But just looking around and taking note of other people's craft, how they do it. One of my favorite first lines, and I use this when I talk to adults or kids, one of my favorite first lines, probably my very favorite first line, is, "Where's Papa going with that axe?" What's that from? Charlotte's Web, right? Is Charlotte's Web a thriller? No, it's not a thriller, but it's thrilling, and it's certainly suspenseful, because my wife hates spiders, but I have video proof of her bawling her eyes out reading about Charlotte, and I won't quote it because I'll mess it up and it's too perfect a line, but read the last line as well. And in fact, I can't quote it because I would cry, and I'm not a crier, right? So the first line and the last line of Charlotte, my wife's crying now. The first line and the last line are perfect lines. And E.B. White spent a lot of time rewriting and making sure they were perfect lines. So that's a great first line. It's not a thriller. Anybody ever read Ken Follett? Ken Follett is a person that I've read with a highlighter. I do a lot of reading with a pencil, not to copy. I don't want to be derivative of what somebody does, but I want to see how they do it. I want to look at how they turn a phrase, how they put things together. There's a really I can't remember the name of the book now. It's called Writing the Blockbuster Thriller, I think. It's by the guy Al Zuckerman that started Writer's House, who Robin, my agent, works at Writer's House. So it was kind of a cool thing. The first time I walked into Writer's House and my wife and I walked in and saw a painting of Ken Follett with all his characters behind him. And he's represented by, or was represented by Zuckerman. So in that book, Writing the Blockbuster Thriller, he takes how Ken Follett puts together a synopsis, how he boils it down, turns it into scenes, and how it ends up in a book. And so I just made that my mantra to study Ken Follett. One of my other favorite first lines is from the Ken Follett book, The Key to Rebecca. I don't know if you ever read that book. It's a very simple line. It's very precise. It's the last camel collapsed at noon. Well, there's so much in that line. Well, what happened to the other camels? What was going on before noon? What made the camel collapse? Oh my gosh, what's he going to do? His camel collapse, right? There's no more camels. There's a lot unsaid in that one sentence of what he said. So in my opinion, every book needs to start with some unanswered questions, whether it's a romance, sci-fi, whatever, but especially a thriller, needs to start with some unanswered question. And that question can be in the form of a bullet thwacking against the podium while Mark's standing up here talking. There needs to be something that makes us read the next sentence. And one thing I've written a couple of articles or short stories for Boys Life magazine, and that's for very young, 8 to 15, 16-year-olds. And I was talking to the editor that edited the short stories for me, and she said, we were chatting back and forth about what it takes to write for 14-year-old boys. And basically we came to the conclusion that if it doesn't mention death or poop in the first paragraph, then they're not going to go on. They just will not read it, right? So you really got to hook them. And that's the thing about a thriller. There's not a lot of navel gazing. There can be some. You can take a breath, but if you're going to do some character building, which I believe you should, that character building, really much of it needs to be done through action, through what they're doing, right? So we talked a little bit about first lines. And how about, let's talk about voice. We talk about an author's voice, right? But also about passive and active voice, right? So you guys know what the difference is. So let's think about a couple of different ideas. You can get away with some passive voice in your books. Everybody has some passive voice in their books. My wife is a retired 8th grade English teacher, so I'm very fortunate that I have her to go over my stuff. And she's brutal because this is our livelihood, right? So I ask her to be brutal. Still hurts my heart, but she fixes things, right? So let's think about, I could say that, let me see, I kind of pulled some stuff out of my head here. So let's say Jericho was riding his motorcycle through heavy traffic when a truck swerved directly towards him. Okay, now that's some action going on, but is that an active voice? Jericho was riding his motorcycle through heavy traffic? No, it's not active at all. It kind of lets us, okay, we're telling him what's happening. Or what about this? Jericho Quinn is the name. Jericho Quinn took the corner quickly around the swerving truck. Okay, maybe a tiny bit better. It's shorter. It's more concise, and at least it's not passive. He took the corner. But when you're going from active from passive to active voice, it doesn't necessarily just mean taking away the was doing or was sitting or whatever. You can say it sometimes a better way. You could say, the last camel lay dying in the desert while Ahmed, got his stuff ready to go, or the last camel collapsed at noon. So being more concise. So instead of telling somebody passively or actively about Jericho Quinn, I could say something like, Jericho Quinn took the corner at speed, leaning into trap, and scraping pegs, and really painting that picture. That's active voice that I'm talking about. So, again, just a couple little things to think about, because I could talk about what makes a thriller, but what I'd really rather talk about is what you want me to talk about, and what you have questions that you have about thrillers. Really quick, I do quite a bit of research, so that's me and my youngest son riding up the Alaska Highway. That was a research trip for, it was really just some time with my youngest son, but we used it as a research trip for Jericho Quinn. Jericho rides that exact same kind of bike. That's I think that's by Jasper, Alberta. We were riding up the Alaska Highway. I was a tactical tracker, a man tracker for the Marshal Service. That's the team up there. It's not military. I was with the United States Marshals, and that's with a military Black Hawk, and they would fly us in when we needed to go remote. I told a story a couple of days ago, or maybe yesterday, it all runs together, about being in a mine and looking down. You see the black photo in the middle. You see that green at the bottom. That's water, and I'm looking straight down into a pit with basically a flooded pit. That's, if anybody came to the presentation the other day, that's the pit with the horse bones or mule bones in the bottom of it. And so just by seeing that pit, I thought, I'm going to have Arliss Cutter have to go down in that pit and swim through an underground tunnel to get up into another cavern where the person he needs to save is, and the bad guys are that he needs to get. So we're adding, you don't have to, I didn't have to get in the pit and swim. I didn't have to subject myself to arsenic and that kind of thing, all the stuff that's in that beautiful water in the back of that mine. That is about 3/4 of a mile into the mountains up behind Juneau. The picture at the bottom is when I was with the Marshal Service on the boat going out in the Kuskokwim and Yukon rivers delivering books to kids with the troopers. Since this is being recorded, I cropped the trooper out. There's an Alaska State Trooper right next to me, and we just go up and down the river. And also, this picture happens to be, while we were out giving these books out, this happens to be about 10 minutes before one of the worst fights, not the worst, but one of the bad fights that I was in, the handful of bad fights I was in during my career. Most fights, incidentally, and this is something that I think we've talked about on Patrick O'Donnell's site, Cops and Writers. Most fights in law enforcement, are not really what you'd think of fights like boxing matches, or I'm going to kill you and you're going to kill me, kind of a to the death kind of a fight. It's somebody trying to get away and you not letting them as a police officer get away. And you can get hurt really bad in that kind of a fight, but it's not exactly the same as when somebody turns on you and says, I'm going to kill you right now, and then I'm going to get away. This was one of those kind of fights. That particular kind of fight started with a naked lady falling out of a house, and ended up with a big fight on the ground with a really cool move that I wouldn't have ever thought of, where the other guy, who's the bad guy, who's half naked, came out of the house, and he was wearing boots, like combat boots. And we had this, I won't go through the knuckle dragging part of it, but we had a fight, and he ended up being slammed on the ground. And before I could jump on him, the combat boot, we call it being scorpioned. Have you ever seen somebody be scorpioned? Where he hit the ground, and the weight of the combat boot caused it to come up behind him and knock himself out with his own boot. It was awesome, and I was like, you're under arrest. I need to write this down, right? So that particular fight ended up almost, people ask me, do you put in exactly what, well, no, it's always inspired by, it's not based on, except in Stone Cross. There's that fight is in Stone Cross, and Arliss was way cooler than I was, and he didn't, like pee blood for a day after the fight like I did. Because we say in the martial arts, when two tigers fight, one is injured beyond repair and the other one's dead. So every fight that I was in that was a real fight, not just affecting an arrest, was painful after it was over. I'm standing in front of an incinerator there. A friend of mine, the DEA, found out that I was going to be writing the Jack Ryan, the Tom Clancy Jack Ryans, and he came over to me and goes, remember Without Remorse when John Clark killed that guy? I don't want to wreck Without Remorse for you, but it was written in the 90s, so sorry. He kills a guy by putting him in a decompression chamber, and he's seeking revenge for his girlfriend/wife getting killed. And he goes, I went and burned up a bunch of seized drugs at this incinerator. You should totally use that in the next book. And so he took me over there, and I interviewed the guy, and sort of joked the people from the city that burn this stuff, and they're showing me how hot this gets. And you can't see it, but on the other side, there's this conveyor belt that goes into this like 2,800 degree furnace. And as the conveyor belt gets closer, and you put, narcotics and pieces of body from the hospital, anything that they need to burn up down to nothing. And as that stuff, you put that on the conveyor belt, as it gets closer, this big metal door goes and opens up, and this gaping maw of fire, and then it goes inside, and then it closes behind it. So you can bet that ended up in a Tom Clancy book. And I asked the guy that ran it, I said, kind of jokingly, and I love my mother-in-law. I really love her. She's just the sweetest lady in the world. But jokingly, I said, "You guys, everybody get any mother-in-law? People bring their mother-in-laws here?" And he goes, "Yeah, all the time." Not a smile. And then he said, "And I can tell you for a fact, it will burn knuckle bones down to nothing." And I said, "Okay, good to know. Good to know." That's doing some research with the Pentagon. I think I mentioned sent about 40 of us on a trip across the U.S. to different bases. That's in, I think, in San Diego at Top Gun. We were doing some, interviewing pilots and stuff like that. And then my wife and I go, at some point, you have to stop doing research and sit down and put your butt in a chair. When we're able, we try to put my butt in a chair on an island in the South Pacific, and that's where we were doing it. So I mentioned those couple little things about research, about adventure, about knowing people that have adventure, about knowing people that know guns, about using like Writers Detective Bureau and Cops and Writers and people friends of friends that you can get your research from to keep that exciting, that verisimilitude, because nothing will run a thriller reader away more quickly, or is it quicker? I'm editing myself. Nothing will run a thriller reader away faster than when they come to an error, when they come to something that, and I have read, just not too long ago, I read one of my favorite authors. I won't even say his name because I still want you guys to read him. He's a multiple New York Times bestselling author, a big name author, and he wrote a sentence or a paragraph where he described a sniper, and the sniper shot. So he's describing the action of as we do, shooting a rifle, and he said, and the bullet left the muzzle and picked up speed. Well, yeah, you all know that. That's just not how physics works, right? And it just gutted me, and I had to put the book down and kind of catch my breath because this guy really, and I mean, my son will tell me, "You were never a sniper, Dad, on a modern SWAT team. You were, because he is a sniper on a modern SWAT team." But I was like a shooter. So I know rifles, right? This particular writer should have known that, and somehow it slipped by. I was able to give it up. But even the guy that I really liked, if he had that all the time, I'd stop reading his books. Now, not everybody would, because not everybody would care about that, but they would care about something else. Excuse me. They would care about something else. So be careful with your details, because thrillers need to move quickly. They need to make people to lose sleep. My very favorite reader email was from a lady that was cussing me out because she lost sleep, and she said she read like this, and that my books were lurid, and she was 82 years old and loved my books. And I thought, okay, that's good. That's what I want. So what I would like to do, and I have enough time, incidentally, to fill up 3 hours. I mean, I have enough material, but I would rather than do that, just telling war stories, I would rather you guys, I need you to get up. We got about 16 minutes now. If you get up and go to the microphone if you have questions, and then I'll try to keep my answers relatively concise. And again, I'll be outside if you have other questions, because I do like talking about this stuff. Excellent.
Hi, Mark. So you talked a little bit about the theory of getting in late and getting out early. How do you apply that on a chapter-to-chapter basis? So when you're writing thriller and you have the suspense going and you want to end a chapter on a note that's going to make them flip the page, how do you do it by finding the balance without kind of cutting the action in the wrong spot?
That's a really good question. So that's an excellent question. I think most of us, unless you're writing a mystery, with the first person, but people that write, I like to write what they call over-the-shoulder point of view. So if I'm in one character's point of view, the vernacular, everything is from their mind, and then from their voice, and then back and forth that way. So what I do is I flit back and forth between this bit of action's going on, and you know how when you can watch a television show or a movie, well, a television show, where when we used to have more commercials, where it would end right when something was about to happen, that you could almost hear the dun dun dun, right? It was like when something like that would happen. Or Batman. Batman is a hokey, the old Adam West Batman. That's a hokey way of thinking of it, but where the action is, the threat is looming, but not happening yet. I wouldn't cut it like in the middle of a fight going on. I would cut it as the fight was about to happen. We knew it was about to happen, or he was coming, or they were coming into a room where the person was hiding. Something like, it was basically that rising action, and before it occurs, cut away to other rising action. You don't want to cut away to just dead space or somebody sleeping, unless so rising action, cut away to other rising action, and then when you come back, you take care of that rising action. You fulfill that promise you made, and then, but they still want it, even though you fulfilled that. Now they got to get back to this other segment, and so you're sort of just playing cliffhanger, cliffhanger, cliffhanger. But you have to reward. You always have to reward. And just really quickly, when I write, I try to always, as I'm writing, when I get up to take a break, I try to always leave the end of the day on the backswing of a punch, or when somebody's falling through the air, or something action, not exposition, so that when I come back, the very first lines that I write in the morning are, and then we get going from there, right? Instead of, I got to get back into describing this house, right? So.
Can you please tell us what was your favorite book that you wrote, and why, and why was it thrilling and stuff like that?
Sure. So my wife always jokes with me that I love the baby I'm about to write and hate the one that I just wrote, because you read it so many times. But looking back, I think the book that has the most of me in it, as far in the Arliss Cutter series, is the one that has that fight. It's called Stone Cross. It has to do with Bush teachers in rural Alaska. My favorite Clancy that I've ever written is the one that's about to come out, because it's set in 1985 when I started police work. So I was able to take Jack Ryan back to the Cold War days and put him on the street. And then my favorite, Jericho, was the one that not the one that my son talked about, but there's one where I go to Japan. Well, I went to Japan because I just retired, and my wife kicked me out of the house because she wasn't used to me being home as much. But my favorite one, because I'm kind of a Japanophile, and I spend a lot of time over there and learn and speak the language a bit. And so I really like a book called Time of Attack, where Jericho goes to Japan. So those are the ones that are the most personal to me, and that's why I like them.
Thank you, Mark. I have a question about female protagonists. I put it on the side about 2 New York City homicide detectives, both female. How do you write a female protagonist successfully?
That's a good question, and I think I talk to a lot of strong women. I happen to be married to a strong woman. I had a very strong grandmother. One of my main characters in the Arliss Cutter series is a Polynesian woman named Lola Ta'ariki, and my grandmother's name was Lola. And I envision, even though my grandmother was not Polynesian, she was very strong, very deliberate in the way she did things. I think I was out of the country for a while, and I think she talked my wife into waiting for me so we could get married. Very strong lady. So I am around strong women. I try to pick but I always, in my books, I try to keep them feminine but strong. And so I just think you have to be real and talk to people and have that ear. But also, there is no such thing as a particular protagonist, male or female, and people are going to be people. So I think you can write them the way that you envision them, and as long as you don't, make every woman curvaceous with, won't go any further than that, but, make it all about their body or their hair color, then describe the woman as you would describe a man. And one of my favorite lines, and I do not think this way, but one of my favorite lines is from As Good as It Gets. You remember that, where Jack Nicholson is getting on the elevator and he's at his publisher, and the publisher's assistant is he writes women's fiction, and Jack Nicholson's just this crusty old dude, and he's getting on the elevator, and the editor's assistant follows him to the elevator like a little puppy, and she says, "How do you do it? How do you write women?" And he says, "I think of a man and take away reason and accountability." Now, obviously, that's not what I think. My wife would smack me if I did. But you really just have to kind of put yourself into their. One of the things that I think about often is that when I was a young police officer, I would come home, my wife and I would, again, without getting too graphic, we would wrestle a lot. And so I would come in and I would show her, look at this new arrest technique I learned today in Aikido, or look at this new jiu-jitsu thing, or look at this, and we would try it out. And I learned very early in our marriage that she did not like to be confined. She did not like for me to use my strength to hold her in space. And I just observed that to say, okay. And then once, and we've been married almost 40 years, once I fell down in between the wall and the bed, and I couldn't do anything, and she was on top of me, and I said, holy crap, this is what it feels like to be trapped. I don't like this at all. So I just draw from those sort of feelings, and then let my wife read it. I'm not I hear a lot of you guys talking about beta readers, and good on you. I'm too timid to give my stuff out because so many people, my editors and copy editors and all those, read it. I want to polish it with my wife. But give it to some female beta readers and let them say, does this ring true?
Thank you.
Thank you.
This question is from online. It's from Coleman Chase. Oh, that's it? We're done?
Or
Okay.
We're 10 minutes
Sorry
over.
about that, Coleman.
No, we're not.
Is he done?
No, it started at 30.
Okay.
That's all right. I was going to jump down there and wrestle. Go ahead.
So we do have a
You
question
get an extra
from
2
online.
minutes now. What?
From Coleman Chase. For writers who love the thriller genre but did not work in law enforcement or military, what are good resources to learn from in addition to cops and writers?
Yeah, so blogs. I often, when I was talking about research the other day, I will Google something as simple as, what does a country smell like? And then somebody that writes that detailed a blog will generally give a lot of really good description. You can get on military websites. You can get on, Police One? I think you can get on Police One. Also, friend of a friend. I think if I had people raise their hands in here, if people knew someone, if people weren't in law enforcement, they would know someone that was, or have a friend that knew someone, and you can just hang around or watch those of us that are in law enforcement at this gathering. We sit around and swap tales impromptu. So we would love to chat about, especially old dudes like me, we're like, pay attention to me, please. So yeah, go and I would mine. I have so much, because I was not in the military, so I go and ask my friends and talk to retired, like as I mentioned before, this F-117 pilot, a stealth pilot for the new Clancy. And he was a great resource because he wants to talk about what is near and dear to him. And military and police, especially retired ones, also do. Yes?
Hi, thank you. How do you find the right balance in an action scene for all of the gun spec and weapon spec, and to make sure that doesn't, it's enough, but it doesn't get in the way of the actual action?
No, and that's a good point. You do have to, and I'll write, oftentimes my first draft will be very heavy with that sort of information, and then I'll just start parsing it down. And again, incidentally, here's another thing that I tell people all the time. You can fix a bad draft. You cannot fix a blank page. And so get it on there. And if you want to write down a bunch of specs, I mean, oftentimes particularly the Clancy editors, because they're technological thrillers, they want me to put more, where I kind of parse it down. And if it's a Wärtsilä engine, I don't necessarily put down how many gigawatts it's putting out or whatever, right? But they say, no, put the gigawatts in. Or I can get pretty down in the weeds about long distance shooting or a sniper, but I find that rather than talking about the Coriolis, the turn of the earth and all of that, and how it works, I'll mention that that's what is in the mind of the character. And then I think 2 books, or maybe the last Clancy, I talked about bullet drop, and how the instead of going into a bunch of trigonometry and why when you're shooting down at an angle you have to use some trigonometric and you'd have to do math to figure out bullet drop, from a certain distance. So I called my son and I said, okay, and he is a sniper, and I said, what would you do here? And he gave me the trig. And then we joked back and forth because he didn't like math in school. I said, man, you're weaponizing your math. That's awesome. So then basically I just say, and then so-and-so he hated trig. Here's what he had to do. He weaponized the math. And that took about a paragraph out of the stuff. So it just needs to be character-centric, whatever your character would be thinking. And some readers really like that kind of technical stuff. I try to err in the middle and give some, but not so much that it bogs down the speed.
When you're writing within a really well-established franchise like Clancy, can you describe just a little bit about what that workflow and what that interaction looks like? Because clearly there's a whole bunch of people that have already got like Bible and stuff. What does the writing inside that workflow look like?
Yeah, so really quickly, Tom Colgan, who's my editor, gave me a very good kind of go off and conquer. Don't write a Tom Clancy novel, write a Marc Cameron novel in the spirit of Tom Clancy. And we come up with a plot. Sometimes that plot could be somebody needs to be kidnapped. And I'm like, okay, that's not a plot, but I'll go from there. Or there needs to be a submarine in it, that kind of plot. So they really give me a lot of free rein. And so I know those characters, I love those characters, and I just write them. The thing that I try to do is be as true to the character as I can, the way Tom Clancy conceived it, which means that John Clark's still a badass, even though he's 70 years old, right? So they give me a lot of free rein, and I just write the book and turn it in, and if they want me to change something, I argue, and most of the time they win, and that's that. Cool. It's really not much different. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways weapons sound when they're firing?
That's a really good question. So YouTube is a good thing, a good resource for that, and the web in general. But I've been around weapons, and most of the time in real life, not on the range, weapons sound like because you don't hear them, right? But when you're in a real firefight kind of a situation, they don't sound much like you don't hear much. The first thing goes off next to you, and then your auditory stuff just sort of goes away. So anytime that I've been around gunfire in a situation where I knew there was gunfire happening, you're either, if it's too close to you, it deafens you, and if it's a little bit further away, you're so stressed that you really get, it's like tunnel vision except for your hearing, and this is what happens to me. Or when I don't want to start a political thing, but we're Alaskans, so we hunt. I never hear the shot loud that goes off when I hunt, or my partner's if my son's hunting. So, but I would take YouTube. You can look up a kind of gun. There's a YouTube channel called Hickok 45, and he shoots a whole bunch of different kinds of guns. You can go there and listen.
But what I'm trying to ask is, how do you write it on the page?
Oh, kaboom! I try to write rather than I say the report of the rifle and then what it's doing. Most of the time, I've got 30 seconds here, and I made a promise I would end. Most of the time, I talk about. I might use the report to register how far away the shooter's coming from or the distance they're coming from. But I don't get too much in the weeds. People know what or I might say it sounded like somebody dropping a pan. Things that people can relate to. What gunfire really sounds like in a crowded room. Thank you guys for coming so much. Look at that, 2 seconds to go. Thank you guys for coming so much. I'll be out in the back. We do have to vacate the room, I understand, and we've already seen what Craig is capable of. So.